Welcome to Culture Meets Crypto, a podcast that dives into the intersection of gaming, music, art, and crypto. Each week, Angela, Ali, and Evan speak with the global founders, CEOs, and thought leaders about many new online economies which are bubbling up in the metaverse. Our conversations will explore new business models with the leaders who are shaping this future.
Okay, welcome back to Culture Meets Crypto with my co-host Evan Castelli. And we are so excited to have Yon from Supersocial today because I was on Yon's podcast Into the Metaverse. And at the end of the conversation, I had so many light bulbs going off that I thought, as one of our first guests, I really would love to have you on our podcast. So, you've been an entrepreneur in many adjacent areas to the metaverse. You have been an entrepreneur in many different, types of technology and media. And I would love for you to go back to your origin story, go way back in terms of the bricks that laid the foundation for where you are now.
Wow, fantastic. Well, first, great to be here. Love the podcast. Congrats on launching it. And, thank you for inviting me. The bricks that came together for where I am today, I think it started with my first memory of how technology impacted me and my identity was when my aunt, who in 1991 came to visit us from the US, always great to live in Israel and have a family in the US, especially, 30 years ago. And she came and she gave me as a gift the Game Gear. People remember the Sega Game Gear, which was a handheld device, which was basically the kind of a next generation pushing on what the Game Boy was by Nintendo, and Sega launched their own handheld device. In a way, it was kind of a Nintendo Switch, but like 30 years ago, right? And she gave me the Game Gear and I plugged in Supersonic Hedgehog. And I was like, wow, I have shivers when I talk about it. The colors, the soundtrack, the gameplay, it was like magic. And it was, and so this is my first connection to how video games can inspire imagination and take you to a whole new world. And I'll kind of reiterate how all of these dots connect, I feel, for where we are today. But that was sort of a big moment for me. Then there was the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and playing Super Mario and all of these incredible games on such a phenomenal device. Funnily enough, in North America, it was called the Nintendo Entertainment System. In Japan, it was called the Family Computer, which I thought is really interesting, right? And that's a really interesting way of like the cultural differences. So that's the first thing. And then as a kid, I was obsessed with sports alongside video games, and I played basketball professionally since I was 5 until I was 17. And so throughout my entire upbringing, essentially, I was always part of a team. And as a kid, even I remember playing Playmobil, the legendary Playmobil figures. And instead of building what the Playmobil box was about, I would collect all of the figures of the Playmobil identities, physical avatars, let's call them. And because I was obsessed with sports, I would build my own teams. So I would take a lot of those figures and I would literally snap with a tape names of real world players, and I would build my own imaginary teams, and I would put them on my shelf in my bedroom. And I'm talking about when I'm like 7, 8, 9. That's kind of the. And so to me, already these two early memories, and if I look at where I am today, how I use technology as an entrepreneur, because I come from social sciences. I'm not an engineer. I come from arts and sociology and political science. And my passion over the years became, how do we use technology to touch people and make an impact on people's lives and empower them and inspire them to be the best version of themselves? And connecting that with my passion for quote unquote building teams, which I've done as a kid with the Playmobil figures. And so I think already these two memories from when I was 8, 9 really cemented ultimately where I ended up being, in my early 20s and kind of embarking on an entrepreneurial journey.
That is amazing. We always think about Roblox, and we'll get into, your connection to Roblox, and maybe right after I say this, I'd love to hear the journey to Supersocial. But I think that idea of you playing with Playmobil is like, that is more, I guess, maybe analogous even to Roblox than Lego was. That is
Absolutely.
interesting. I never have heard that. I've never kind of made that connection.
I think a lot of people talk about Lego. And by the way, my first company, which was a computer company that gave a computer to young people to build and code themselves, was very much inspired by the combination of the cleanliness and the beauty of an Apple design, but also with the Lego bricks approach of how you put one pieces together, and it's super, super simple. But I do agree with you that Playmobil, what Playmobil gave and still gives to young people, is the ability to create their own narrative and stories. It's more about the stories than it's about the plug and play building blocks. And I agree with you. I think it developed a different type of skill. And in a way, Roblox, although the engine is built in a plug and play way, you're building essentially worlds and narrative and stories that people can get excited about and want to be immersed in. So I think you're onto something there.
Mm-hmm. It's super interesting that you said stories, because we had John Linden on the podcast, and he threw out an idea that I hadn't really heard before, which is that gaming is very much like fashion. We always have felt that gaming and crypto are very different worlds. And he had, he was talking about gaming and fashion being similar worlds, because there's production, there's seasons, there's lore, there's a story. And so I love that. And, we're students of behavior change. So I think this is why, hearing your past, why we really bonded. I did hear I want to get to Supersocial and how you came to creating that, but bigger picture, I would love for you to share what you shared on Dylan Collins's podcast about game engines. And he's a friend of mine and a friend of yours, so I hope it's okay with him that I lifted that out. But I was really inspired by that concept. Can you go into the game engine bigger picture idea?
Yeah, I think game engines are really, in a way, they're sort of, if you look historically, we started with a browser, right? The desktop, and then we had the browser, and everything was on the browser. And then we had this phenomenal innovation, which was the smartphone and the launch of the iPhone and the operating system of the mobile phone, of the smartphone, iOS and Android, really created this new engine of content with millions of applications. And that enabled to create new type of things, new type of story, new type of experiences. And I think my hypothesis with regards to the game engine was the notion that this is a era defining technology this decade, and I think even more so beyond 2030. And it's a technology that is really going to ultimately be the backbone of what we think of the transition of the internet from 2D to 3D. But it's not just the internet. If you're looking at entertainment, if you're looking at Hollywood and movie studios, if you're looking at the way people are now designing cars and the evolution of something like the Omniverse by NVIDIA. And so I do believe that at the core of those technologies, the game engine, especially from a consumer standpoint, I do believe the game engine is going to potentially be one of the most defining inventions and technologies over the next 20 to 30 years. But what's fascinating about the game engine, very similar to the internet, is that this is a technology that has been slowly developing for, the past 30 years. Epic Games started to work on the Unreal Engine 25 years ago. Roblox is a 17-year-old company. NVIDIA is a 20-something-year-old company. These companies have been around for a long time, but now, as we also talk about the metaverse, the game engine is really cementing its position as a defining technology for this new era of the consumer internet.
Yeah, and it's really going to be interesting to see the Unreal Engine kind of, productize, I guess, and have different offerings based on, age, ability, etc. And I'm just so excited to see this creation and collaboration among kids. And that's something that you've really leaned into in your past. Can you just talk about that behavior change? A lot of people talk about Gen Z, and it's all about Gen Z, and I agree with that. But I see even a newer, more entrenched behavior of creativity and collaboration in Gen Alpha. So anyway, I just love to hear your thoughts on these younger generations.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. So, I think from the standpoint of Gen Z, which, just to kind of clarify, I guess, to the audience, these would be people were born typically between 1996 and 2010, right? So this is the first generation that is internet native. And they grew into a world that is consumed by devices, especially mobile phones and tablets, right? And so when I started my first company, Kano, in 2013, I think it was the beginning of that generation starting to be immersed in these new internet modalities like Minecraft and Roblox, especially. Fortnite came later on. Fortnite came 5-6 years later. And that was on the back of a previous generation. Everyone remembers Kalab Penguin and all of these kind of first generation internet Moshi monsters, kind of first generation internet portals or worlds where young people are spending their time. And really Roblox and Minecraft came in. And what happened with that, I think there are two fundamental things that happen because of platforms and games like Minecraft and Roblox. The first one, they created a whole new layer of social experience for young people. So when we, the three of us here, were communicating on things like WhatsApp and Instagram, and of course, Facebook became the dominant place where millennials and Gen Xers communicate and interact. We had these new internet modalities like Roblox and Minecraft, where suddenly this new generation was consumed and no one seemed to understand. Everyone felt, oh, until today, people think of Roblox as a game and Minecraft is a game. But what I saw building kind of a consumer device with Kano for this new generation was that this is a whole new social modality of how this generation interacts. Accidentally, it revolves around the game, but that's not the point. The point is, this is the new sandbox. This is their new thing. And it only got accelerated and amplified 10x because of COVID. And I think the second thing that is really fundamental is the notion of identity. Suddenly, it's not a 2D internet where you interact with text or even video. Suddenly, you are immersed in these 3D worlds and you manifest your personality as an avatar that suddenly represents who you are. Either if it's on Roblox, where there's much more freedom of how to express yourself with the avatar, but also on Minecraft. And so I think those two things became very profound for that generation, ultimately empowering them to also become, creators either on Minecraft or Roblox. And I think if we now look at Gen Alpha, which is essentially, again, most likely people who were born after 2010, I think of Gen Alpha really as the first metaverse native generation. So this is the first generation that is really not just born, but this is the first generation that is really growing into a world where almost the only thing that matter are those multiplayer 3D immersive virtual worlds like Minecraft, like Roblox, like Fortnite. And I think the paradigm shift here that also inspired me to start Supersocial, almost 2.5 years ago was the insight that this is it. We're never going back to just YouTube videos and Instagram and so on and so forth. We are now moving together with these younger generations into a world where caring about your 3D avatar in virtual worlds is going to be as important for your own personal identity as you care about your own physical identity. And there's a lot of data to support that claim, but I think that is what really happening now. And I think those two generations are going to define also what does it mean to live and interact with an internet that is primarily in 3D in 5, 10, 15 years from now.
So what you're saying is that communities have really been evolving as tech has evolved. And now we have this more digitally focused lifestyle, especially younger people, plus new levels of interactivity. Sort of on that note, growing up, I used to play a lot of single player video games, as did my friends. And now sort of none of us play single player video games. Everyone doesn't have as much fun playing those. So we all play together virtually. But I want to ask you, so with Supersocial, you're sort of helping build communities or usher in communities around gaming experiences. How does that work with when a brand approaches you and you have to kind of bring a new community to a brand? I saw that Supersocial just worked with NARS Cosmetics. I want to ask you a little bit about that experience of working with a brand like that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and maybe just to kind of just clarify in a 30 seconds what we're focusing on at Supersocial. So, we first of all, we started the company because of that insight that the internet is moving to a 3D realm, and we wanted to be in a position where we can build the next generation of iconic games, experiences, and brand worlds for these new generations of consumers. And in a way, being inspired by Supersonic, Super Mario, and the Nintendo early days of the 90s, really creating that level of iconic classic experiences with amazing soundtrack, quality of experience, and really creating things that will use these emerging technologies in the same way that Nintendo and Sega used technology to innovate with games in the early 90s. And so at Supersocial, we essentially are building these cutting edge experiences, and we design, develop, produce, publish, and operate our own IP, but also branded experiences. And now to answer more directly your question, I think what's really interesting, again, very similar to what happened in the in the middle of the first decade of 2000 with the arrival of Facebook, we had the Facebook page, and every brand wanted the Facebook page, and they didn't even know why, but they just had to have a Facebook page. And then a very similar thing happened with the iPhone, when every brand wanted an app. Why do you need an app? Well, we don't know, but there's this really incredible thing called the iOS, and we need an app. And the KPIs were very shallow, both on the Facebook page and on the iOS apps initially. And I think what happens now, we're starting to see an institutional adoption of brands of quote unquote metaverse environments, these internet in 3D. And not surprisingly, it starts with games. And so we are interacting with a lot of brands now, some of which we're partnering primarily by building incredible experiences on the Roblox platform. And you mentioned one, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit more in a bit. But really what these brands are doing, they are starting to learn, what does it actually mean to bring our brand values, our brand proposition? What does it mean to build a community? What does it mean to interact with these new generation, Gen Alpha, Gen Zs, and build relationship with them, but meet them where they are, which is not in any of those platforms that we've seen dominant in the past 10, 15 years, especially not Facebook, but they are in quote unquote, what we refer to still as a 3D video game. But again, that's why I want to reiterate that while we're looking at these environments as video games, for this new generation, this is where they meet friends. This is where they play together. And so I think of Fortnite, Roblox, Minecraft to some extent as a new generation of social platform accidentally revolving around games. And so when brands are coming into these ecosystems, and when we work with brands, of course, we need to build quote unquote game experiences because they're still very much revolved around games and gameplay and fun and engagement. And I think we're in the very early stages of a journey of games being mainstreamed, not necessarily as video games, but as the new modality of a social experience on the web.
And as you work on Roblox, another question for you. After Mojang just announced that Minecraft NFT creators can't make Minecraft NFTs anymore, do you think we need NFTs for the metaverse, for these gamified experiences?
I don't think it has to be there. I don't think for the metaverse to be a metaverse, NFTs is a must-have component. However, let's put it this way. I don't think that for the metaverse to emerge and for people to enjoy, I don't think people are going to walk around the streets with big signs saying, if you don't incorporate NFTs, we're not going to be there. We're not going to be in the metaverse. There's not going to be. I think there's going to be a certain community who will be very vocal, as we're seeing now around Web3 and NFTs and so on and so forth. And I think we live in a free world where people can choose to vote with their legs, quote, with their virtual legs, and decide where they want to spend their time and money. However, I do believe in the vision of a user-owned internet where people can truly own their digital assets. So if I go to Roblox and I invest in the course of 10 years, $10,000 to purchase avatar items, I, as a user, would very much like to own those digital assets. It doesn't mean necessarily I need to interoperably bring them to Fortnite and other games, because that becomes too complex unless it's my own games as a publisher and I can enable that interoperability. But I do think that just the notion, the promise of users truly owning their digital assets, I think that is a very important promise if I exclude all the speculative and volatility elements of NFTs. And I would say, as a comment to the Minecraft thing, I totally understand my Minecraft and slash Microsoft, because I don't think that's a Mojang decision. I think it's a Microsoft decision to completely clear up this NFT thing. All the way I would imagine that, Phil Spencer himself had to give an order, shut it down because of all of the discrepancies. But I do believe they chose the simple way out. It's a much more complex conversation to have on what blockchain plays and what role NFTs play in these Web 2 walled guarded platforms. And I'm very curious to see what Roblox is going to do, because they have stated that they are thinking and working on how Roblox experiences can be integrated with NFTs and with blockchain. And I also saw that recently they are even hiring people for a Web3 engineering team. So I think we're in the very early stages of how these technologies merge together. But it's obvious that to truly enable an open, interoperable metaverse, which is the vision of everyone, which will take a long time to create, you will need interoperability. You will need shared standards, and you will need to see how technologies like NFT and blockchain are integrated, not just into new platforms, but also into platforms that are at the moment the most dominant.
I just have to jump in because we, I think, again, see eye to eye on this, because we left the traditional world. We were at Guggenheim most recently in the traditional world, and we left to focus on this intersection. And I've always believed from the very beginning that NFTs would be a tool that enable economies inside digital spaces. But that's just one thing that's happening inside digital spaces. And we talked about Tim Sweeney last time, and I've always felt that even though Epic Games has not embraced NFTs natively, he is a Web3 minded person, and he's instituting the ethos of Web3, which is what I care about more than NFTs. And I wanted to read you really quickly his reaction yesterday. When you were talking, it just reminded me of his reaction. He said, somebody on Twitter asked him, hey, Epic Games, it'd be really nice to see the same opinion from Epic Games. Get rid of every last one of those games, talking about NFTs and supporting Minecraft on the decision, which I totally agree with you. This was a Microsoft thing, let's be honest. But anyway, Tim Sweeney said, developers should be free to decide how to build their games, and you are free to decide whether to play them. I believe stores and operating system makers shouldn't interfere by forcing their views onto others. We definitely won't. That really encapsulates this idea that yes, and yes, it'll all be happening.
I fully agree, Angie. I think it's such a smart comment from Tim Sweeney. You have these two, I described it once in an interview that it's like a clash of civilizations, right? It's like, and it's clashing, and there's really, really strong opinions and proponents on both sides. And I love Tim Sweeney's reaction, because he basically reduced this tension, right? He was like, guys, it's not about NFTs. We need to embrace these changes. And we are taking the opinion of not excluding anyone, as long as they abide by, the sort of the terms of service and so on and so forth. And you're right. I think it's a really smart comment on your end to describe Tim Sweeney as, he's a Web3 minded person, because he believed genuinely, and that's why he went on a fight with Apple. He believes in open platforms and shared standards. And he was the one who said that his job is to increase the TAM of gaming, right? And so, and that's why there's so many discrepancies around what is the TAM of the metaverse. Is it 8 billion? Is it 10 trillion? Who knows? Maybe it's more than 100 trillion. If we are truly going to build an open, interoperable 3D internet, we're building a whole realm that I don't think anyone can fully acknowledge the scale, the size, and diversity of what could happen when we are going to spend and be immersed in completely new modality of social interaction. And what does that mean for the creation of new economies?
Yeah, I was around when the iPod was announced, and the traditional equities world. And I remember I was talking to an investor when the press release came out, and the mantra among investors was, I already have a Walkman. Like, what's the TAM for this? Little did they know the TAM was the smartphone TAM, which is everyone. And that's kind of when I see these analyses around TAMs, I think that's kind of a fun thing to do on a Friday night, but it doesn't really impact the way this is really going, which is pretty much everywhere, it feels like, and anywhere the analog world was, pre iPhone and pre kind of Instagram, Facebook, and this kind of velocity of social media or social capital pickup, anything analog in terms of social media and identity feels like it's going there. And that's a huge world.
Because people come to it from like this top-down approach of analyzing different industries and different sectors, and this is what management consulting firms and investment banks do, and it's totally fine. And this is their job to create this so their clients can have a sense of the size. But the way I look at it is the human behavior. I look at my 1-year-old baby girl, and I'm thinking,
and
wow,
she's so cute, by the way.
Thank you so much. She's growing so fast, and I'm thinking, wow, like, this is going to impact every facet of her life, from friendship to learning to work to leisure to entertainment to travel. And when you think about what does it mean for the human behavior, this is where all the big questions are. And this is why I think it's so difficult to fully comprehend how big the metaverse could be, because if it's really going to touch human behavior at the depth that we're describing, and that 3D avatars will become an extension of our life, but in a much deeper way, I think the TAM is much bigger than what I think at the moment people estimate.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So I want to get into stakeholder capitalism, but I think Evan has another question that he wants to touch on first, because it's a big topic.
I wanted to kind of touch on how metaverse is being used in places like Korea, where they're really building out this infrastructure for people of all ages, because we've mostly been talking about gaming metaverses, gaming experiences, kind of focused on young people and new generations growing up. But Korea has been investing a ton of money. I think Shanghai recently put in 1.5 billion into the development of this idea for just public infrastructure metaverses. And I think that's a really interesting concept, and kind of speaks to your idea that this could be way bigger than we think. This isn't just going to be for younger people. It's going to be for kind of aiding everyone in new levels of interactivity.
One thing that I admire about the Asian culture is that they have been immersed in virtual identity for a very long time. I mean, an example of that would be that, and I don't know where I saw that data point, but in Japan, it's not uncommon for someone to have multiple profiles of social media. It's not uncommon, right? Here we have one kind of on Twitter and Facebook. It's pretty much the same in the way. It's not uncommon. And so all that notion that I described, I believe there's going to be more than 100 billion people in the metaverse, because each of us could have multiple identities. So the global population that would impact the TAM, Angie, to our previous conversation, is much larger, because I might have 5, 6, 7 identities in the metaverse, and I'm gonna want all of them to like be outfitted and exciting. And if you think I'm crazy, I mean, it's not. So you're going to have an identity where you go to a concert. You're going to have an identity that you go to school. You have an identity that you just play video games with your friends. And I do believe that ultimately we're going to have more than potentially 100 billion, human beings in the metaverse. I don't think that's a crazy assumption to make. But also what's unique is about Asia and Korea, especially, Evan, as you mentioned, South Korean companies have been at the forefront of the innovation in gaming, right? They were really big. Live operations and live services really emerged from South Korean gaming companies. And then it has been adopted by kind of Western game companies. And I think what we're seeing now in South Korea, what we're seeing in China, I think what we're seeing when governments like Dubai invest, billions of dollars in building blockchain, Web3, metaverse ecosystem to attract employment, I think it's coming from a place, in my opinion, where they understand that it's not just about kids, and it's not just about games. It's about education, and it's about healthcare, and it's about work, and it's about innovation. And I come to it from a landscape, even though I'm a CEO of a company that at the moment is primarily focused on the Roblox platform, which is primarily for under 24-year-olds. I definitely want to build and be involved in building a metaverse for the rest of us. What does it mean to access the metaverse and manifest my personality? As a 38-year-old family person, right? And where do I go when I want to hang out with my friends? Like, what is that translation of the street from Snow Crash for the rest of us, not for the kids? Because the metaverse starts at the moment with this platform that are really geared toward, the Gen Z and Gen Alpha, but hey, with the evolution of healthcare and technologies for medical technologies, like, we're going to be around here for quite a long time, millennials, Gen Xers, and so on and so forth. And so what is the metaverse where we're going to spend the next 50 years of our life? Not only I think this is a massive frontier for innovation, but you are starting to see, to your point, how South Korea, China, Japan are thinking about it from a much wider landscape of what does it mean for the wider population. And I'm very excited about that, because I do believe a 3D internet is not just going to be for kids. We're all going to be there. But what does it mean for Angie, for you, for me, is going to be very different than what it means for a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many, there's so much done back there. But what we talk about a lot is this big gap in generations from, Gen X to millennial was a big gap. From millennial to Gen Z is a big gap. And the gaps keep widening. And so the idea of bridging back to those earlier generations, I think is hugely valuable, and nobody's really talking about that. So I'm glad that you're really going to be leaning into that. So I have both generations of kids, and your daughter is only one, but she's alpha, right? She's still alpha?
I think anyone born after 2010 basically is considered, yeah.
So we're going to get our daughters together one day. So my older kids are Gen Z, and then my daughter, my 10-year-old is alpha. And I see such a big difference. And I was interviewing an undergrad the other day for an internship, and my 10-year-old was in the other room, and she has a dress store in Roblox. And by the way, and she overheard me interviewing this person, and she came in and she said, "Mom, I could work for your company. You could learn from what I'm doing in Roblox," and she made a really compelling pitch. And I thought, wow, the difference between even her generation and my kids who are Gen Z is pretty wide. So, helping train the rest of us to access the metaverse, I think, is hugely important. And by the way, I think Serafina should be, we should be hiring our kids at some point to come help us.
I love it. I've always been a big fan of setting like kind of kids advisory boards for the companies I start, because I think they have the best insight and really learning from the human behavior. But I think you're right. There is a big gap. And I do think it's going to be increasingly more challenging for millennials and Gen Xers to understand how Gen Z and to a larger extent Gen Alpha, what does this mean for them, and what is the life that they see when they interact with these platforms. And with Gen Alpha, I think what's really profound, and that's why I kind of refer to that generation as the first metaverse generation. For me, the key distinction on that point between them and Gen Z is the notion of they are born and raised into the modality that they have a dual identity. They have the physical identity and they have their avatar identity. And Gen Z didn't have that yet. Gen Z, when they were kids, there wasn't yet Roblox and Minecraft. But Gen Alpha, they are born into these worlds already in existence, and they see that from age 4, 5, 6, 7. And so I believe that's the first generation where a avatar identity in 3D is going to be literally second nature to them in a way that has never been before to any generation.
I love that concept. And I'd never really thought about that between my two daughters. So I have a daughter who's Gen Z and a daughter who's Gen Alpha. And the Alpha has grown up playing Roblox, and she has all of her Roblox, avatars. And then my older daughter had to go through this Instagram phase, which was really kind of negative, generally speaking. If I had to summarize it, negative or positive, I'd say it's generally negative for self-esteem, because it's actually you, and you're actually in there performing in a one-way broadcast stream. and constantly being judged. And that whole judgment, like the judgment of self is not there with Roblox. It's fun. It's creative. Like you said,
because there is a relationship. You have no relationship with people who like or dislike your Instagram photo. There's no correspondence. There's no relation. You don't experience anything together. You're just being observed and judged, and that's why it impacts self-esteem. And I think it's a really, really important insight also on how, while I expect there to be challenges with expression, identity, safety in metaverse platform, I do believe that when you are building a relationship with people, you're experiencing something together. It's way different than that one-way judgmental environment where you are being judged by many, many, many people, and there is no correspondence, there is no relationship, there is no experience that you're exploring together. You're just sharing an image from some place you've been on Earth, and someone is a completely different place in the world, and they judge you on that, and that's it. There's no experience.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, so I wanted to get to stakeholder capitalism before we end, because when I was on your podcast, we talked about this topic, and it prompted me to go do more studying of Klaus Schwab, the co-founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, and what he's written about this. And where I was coming from when we talked about it was this idea that, I used to be I was in traditional finance for 20 years, and it always felt like a zero-sum game where it's us versus them. It's our companies that we're advising versus other companies. It's the companies we're analyzing versus other companies. Employees are only kind of really focused on their little niche. And what I really love about the Web3 world and this kind of explosion of collaboration is this idea that, there's this, we always say there's this circle, and it used to be money flows in from investors and then money flows out to investors, and the workers are just working. Whereas now all of the people in that circle, because there's more transparency, also are garnering the value that they're creating. But you articulated it so well. I'd love for you to expand on that.
I think first I would say I have been impressed and inspired for many, many years now, I think for the better part of the last 10 years, by people, especially like Marc Benioff, who I'm proud to call an investor across numerous companies that I started. And I've always been enamored and inspired by the way Marc Benioff thinks of business as a catalyst for change, not just for business change, but for social change. And he wrote a whole book, where he describes his philosophy and how they built Salesforce to be a platform for change as a company. Of course, you need to build a great business and enterprise and profitability and so on and so forth. But as a company, you have the opportunity to create something that is much, much bigger than a business. You have the opportunity to create a community. And being inspired by these philosophies for such a long time, when we had a conversation the other time on the podcast, one of the things that I find fascinating, there is kind of these two parallel things happening at the same time. On the one hand, there is this growing frustration and disillusionment by the capitalist system of the last 50 years, where majority of the stock market in the United States is owned by a very small proportion of people from the United States population. And that means that, majority of people do not really enjoy the fruits of the capitalist system, which is to a large extent manifested through the stock market. And I think what's really interesting with Web3, that it aims to create this alternative financial system. I'm not talking about necessarily Web3, DeFi and stuff like that. I'm just talking about the philosophies and the fundamental way of thinking that all of us need to gain. In the context of a token, for example, again, putting aside the complexities, the challenges, the regulation, not talking about that, the fundamental philosophy in my mind behind the token and behind building tokenized companies or tokenized brands or tokenized protocols is really building something that a much, much wider community can enjoy the financial upside in a way that is much more scalable than in a business where you have stock options. And And this is not to say that the current system is not good. It's good, but it's not big enough. It's not scalable enough. And also what happens once a company becomes public, in many cases, it becomes too expensive for many more people to participate and to buy into the ownership of a public stock. And so that's kind of where we talked about and came to my mind this notion of a stakeholder capitalism, where I think we have an opportunity over the next 10 years to really work and help shape a whole new system where many, many more people can enjoy the economic upside of a certain venture or a certain business. And I'm not just talking about founders, employees, investors. I'm talking about partners. I'm talking about communities. I'm talking about the population where you live. Salesforce, another thing they've instituted, which was pioneering, is the 1-1-1 model, where 1% of employee time goes to the community projects, 1% of equity of the company was allocated to the Salesforce Foundation, through which Salesforce over many years have been funding all sorts of social initiative and empowering underserved communities and important causes. And that's great in the existing structure of the capitalist system. What I'm thinking about is, how do we do that at a much larger scale? How do we use these emerging technologies like tokens, like blockchain, like DAOs, to imagine a new way of building organizations and enterprises in a way that from the beginning, in a method of which it's already ingrained into the structure of growth and the value of the enterprise? How do we build something that can also ultimately not just build, but also be adopted by the wider business community? Otherwise, we'll keep having these clash of civilizations where, you have the stock market, the existing way of capitalist system, and then you have these kind of rebels of Web3 and DAOs and all of these wacky things that majority of people think it's nuts and doesn't make any sense. And I think a lot of that we should come together to figure out what is the value of these technologies and how can we create these new systems where many more stakeholders can enjoy the economic upside of a great enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, I am a NARS, consumer. And when I saw the NARS, and Evan referenced it, that you're working with them, I thought that's amazing, because I'm a huge fan. I use their products. I talk about their products, and how great would it be to feel a part of that community? There's so many of these things. Like that's a small example, but it might be a bigger example for somebody else. But there are other kind of things that are not, that where you could be a part of the community and still be in a very authentic space in terms of connecting with a brand that is completely different from advertising. Which
and I think
that less
I agree with you. And I think this is why, excuse me for going a bit kind of historically, but for a very long time, for about 500 years, the church has played the everything role in people's life. That has declined over the last 50 years with the rise of the nation state. And the nation state, at least in big parts of the world, the nation state become basically the everything for people. And I think over the last 20 years, for a lot of different reasons, right? The decline of economic growth for people, the uncertainty of the financial system, the uncertainty of democratic systems. And I think what's happening over the last 10, 15, 20 years is that brands, in general, brands are becoming the new church of the 21st century. And I think if you look at all of these technologies, I believe brands have the opportunity to not only, and I'm not saying that all brands like that. I do believe there is a lot of authenticity in many, many brands, but there is an opportunity to build brands that are not just, let's build a great community with the auspice of that driving the bottom line, and it's going to help us be much more, profitable and so on and so forth, and kind of treat communities like basically Facebook has been treating their users to drive up their enterprise value and take all of the content for free. I think we have an opportunity to also reimagine what does it mean to be a brand in a world full of uncertainty, financially, politically, with climate uncertainty. What is the role of a brand? And then if you connect that role of a brand as an entity that can help build a better world for people, for certain communities, and if you connect that with what does it mean to enable economic upside for many more people beyond the core shareholders, employees, investors of today. I think there's something there to be unlocked. And it could well be that blockchain and Web3 is part of a new movement where we can really reimagine not just the financial system, but what type of entities in the 21st century are going to take on the role that the church left behind and then the nation state starts to leave behind. And I'm not talking about a world controlled by corporations. I'm talking about a world where corporations and brands or financialized communities can play in people's lives, potentially all the way up to all sorts of much more regulated and structured communities emerge because of these new brands and these new communities.
Wow, that was big. And I'm glad I saved it for last. Now I know that everyone will listen to the very last minute of this podcast. Your insights are so different and so inspiring, Yon. Thank you so much for taking part in our podcast, Culture Meets Crypto. Really, really appreciate it. And where should people find you?
People can find me on Twitter at Yonatan RF and can find me also on LinkedIn, Yonatan Raz-Fridman. And please feel free to reach out. We'd love to talk about all of those different things and what it means for our future. Thank you for having me, Angie and Evan. It was great.
Thank you, Yon.
Great, Evan, another episode wrapped. The episode with Yon Raz-Fridman was just awesome. Asking him to go back to his origin story and hearing about his childhood memories of building teams with Playmobil and, also the magic that he felt when he played Sonic for the first time was really fun. And it actually really makes sense. A lot of people talk about Lego in reference to Roblox, but actually Playmobil makes a huge amount of sense when you think about what he's done within the Roblox space, and then also as co-founder of Supersocial.
Yeah, and given that background of working on Supersocial and Roblox, I was excited to talk to him about the Minecraft ban on NFTs and if we actually need NFTs or blockchain for a successful metaverse. And we kind of came to the conclusion that we don't need them in a metaverse for it to be successful, but to ban them kind of limits how much gaming can grow, because we already have microtransactions, skins, and customizable items, but still none of that can really be owned by the players. So like mobile games and free-to-play games were early and people kind of scoffed at them at first, I think blockchain is right now just that early concept in gaming. And if we don't ban it, it could really change the landscape.
Definitely. A lot of the details, I think, around these metaverses are evolving. And that is more difficult to call, but a bigger picture concept that he honed in on is something that we talk about a lot, which is the move away from the quote zero sum game of the old world of Web 2, in which there's this big pot of money in the middle of the room and everybody's going for the quote winner take all status or winner take most. Yon referenced the importance of the concept of stakeholder capitalism. This was an idea that originated 50 years ago. Klaus Schwab, the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, wrote about it. It argues that shareholder capitalism has taken us down this unsustainable path potentially, and what will emerge are systems which distribute value to participants in a network community based on the value that each of those participants contributes to the community.
Yeah, another thing that kind of reminds me of is that idea of how big the TAM of the metaverse can get, how many people can participate in that greater community. And Yon believes, like we do, that it could be way bigger than just gaming. It could extend to older people, younger people, everything in between, from working to health insurance, and everyone, like 100 billion people in the span of many, many years could be in the metaverse and have multiple avatars.
Yep. Great. Okay. Another episode wrapped. Thank you all for listening to Culture Meets Crypto with Signum Growth, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.